Hi, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for February 24th, which is Thursday. And Alicia, I think you and I might be the only ones in this class because you are the only one who is participating in our discussion forum. So I'm just going to proceed and catch us up with the syllabus. This has been a very unique semester in so many ways, but I appreciate you being here. And where we left off was talking about A Rose for Emily. And I can't quite recollect if I talked about the narration of Rose for Emily, that it was a we narrator, so that we got a sense of the townspeople who are portrayed very negatively. Certainly, we see that they are, in some ways, rather hopeful that Miss Emily is going to experience a descent, in part because of the jealousy associated with her former position, and perhaps also in part because of the injustices that allowed her to have her former position. But certainly we can see that even though we may not necessarily always be able to trust their impressions of Miss Emily, we can certainly trust their actions and their behavior. The fact that they hope or at least anticipate that Miss Emily is going to kill herself and don't do anything to intervene, I think says volumes about the kinds of individuals who live in Miss Emily's community. And of course, I also talked a little bit about Faulkner's On a Rose, his interview, where he was giving some of his perspectives about his piece, but the interview was years after he had written it, so I'm not sure how accurate the interview would be, especially because many of the elements of the interview seem to be rather unsatisfying, at least from my perspective, such as his definition of the title, where I think there's lots of symbolic and metaphorical possibilities with the title that he never addressed. That said, perhaps he just didn't want to, either because he didn't want to supply us with an answer or because he simply, as he said, was writing a story. And if there is any kind of additional meaning, he's not saying that's not there, but that wasn't his primary, at least conscious intention. So where that leaves us in short story is talking about three short stories that are very different from one another. And I had assigned all three of these because I thought that they were very different from one another, but all of them were canonical. So we had talked about those works considered by scholars and critics to be worthy of study. The first being Young Goodman Brown, written in archaic language, so not necessarily the easiest read, but I think in many ways quite contemporary because it talks about what happens when an individual loses their faith. Now, this is an allegorical story, which means that everything is supposed to be symbolic and representational. So, young Goodman Brown, he's young because that represents innocence and naivete, and he's on a journey of self discovery. Goodman would have been the term that would have used to show respect at the time. The title, much like Mr., but good man. But of course, Goodman is a good man. And Brown, the idea that he becomes soiled after he learns about the hypocrisies that exist within his community. And soil also works very nicely for the fact that he goes into the wilderness, which is another symbol or metaphor for that which is untamed. And we'll never know for certain whether or not there was a witch meeting. In fact, the author, Nathaniel Hawthorne, directly confronts that at the ending of the piece. Had Goodman Brown fallen asleep and dreamt a dream of a witch meeting? And the response is, be it so if you will. In other words, whatever. And that this piece is deliberately constructed in such a way so that we can never know definitively if a witch meeting happened or not, because in the end it doesn't matter. What matters is Goodman's journey and how Goodman changes for the worse because of his journey. A journey that we all need to take when we realize that our faith will be tested and that those individuals we had placed our faith into would not necessarily always live up to our expectations. This is particularly relevant when it comes to Puritanism, which would have been the religion of the time period. This gives us a sense of some of the history of New England as well, where in England, the Puritans, a very strict religious sect that believed in pure evil or pure goodness, and that the role of humanity was to suffer until they could be rewarded in the afterlife. They were persecuted for their beliefs, and they left England, and they came to the American colonies, and they formed a New England, particularly in Salem, Massachusetts. And I mention that because of the irony and hypocrisy of their actions afterwards. In Salem, they basically persecuted individuals who didn't fit into their religious philosophies. In other words, they did the same thing that was done to themselves. And this is where the Salem witch trials came about, where basically they were identifying mostly women who were seen as outsiders or who weren't following the Puritan ethos and accused them of witchcraft. And this story very much is about that heritage of Salem. Nathaniel Hawthorne coming from family members who were involved in the Salem witch trials. And he was very upset about that and oftentimes would write about that in his writing. Almost like a William Faulkner being upset about some of the history of Southern slavery and would be critical of that in his writing. So, the idea of young Goodman Brown going on this journey represents the fact that perhaps he's not completely good. Because if he were, then he would never be engaged in a journey that could be associated with evil. In fact, Faith tries to hold him back a while. That's a literal Faith, his wife, but also his figurative Faith. But he has to do this representational of the journey that we all have to take. Eventually, we all must experiment or descend into evil, at least according to Hawthorne. You don't necessarily have to agree with the short story's perspective, but you do need to understand the author's perspective when the author was creating that particular short story. He leaves at sunset, and the time of day is representational for descent and darkness. And he goes into the wilderness again, the wild and untamed area, and has his faith tested, his religious faith and his faith in humanity. And we find out that Goodman and Faith are newlyweds. This is also supposed to represent being innocent and naive. They've been married 3 months. 3 is a very important Christian symbol when we talk about the idea of the Trinity. And he comes across a traveler that may have elements associated with evil and the devil, who may be capable of supernatural events. But every time that's suggested to us, it's undercut. So, for instance, the staff is wriggling like a snake. And the snake is such an important symbol in Christianity because ultimately the snake is supposed to be the element of evil that tempts Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And basically, Adam and Eve eat from the fruit of forbidden knowledge. And you can say that this is very much Goodman's story, is that he goes to find forbidden knowledge, to learn that the townspeople are not as pure and pious as they appear to be. And unfortunately, he's destroyed because of that. And he sees that sin and hypocrisy with basically everyone. But going back to that staff, because the staff is wriggling, it would appear that it is some sort of supernatural entity associated with evil or the devil. But then we're told that that must be some sort of ocular deception by the uncertain light. In other words, it must be a figment of his imagination, or that he is seeing something in poor light that is not there. And this happens over and over again. So we're told that there's a huge fire, for instance, but then Goodman awakes and sees dew on the trees. How could there be water or dew on the trees if there had just been previously a huge fire? So over and over again we'll see this, because again, we're not meant to know whether or not the witch meeting happened or not. And in fact, I think it helps to reinforce the ambiguity when something is unclear, not just of the events that occur, but the ambiguity that exists within humanity as well. That very rarely is someone purely evil or purely good, that we have elements of both between us or within us. So Goodman encounters quite a few people that he would never expect to encounter. Again, when we read it from a 2020s perspective, we might not be surprised to learn that politicians are involved with evil, but at the time that would have been rather surprising. And church leaders, including Goody Cloyce. And she's particularly important because she taught Goodman Brown his catechism, which means basically she was his Sunday school teacher. So he's horrified to see her there. He sees all kinds of professionals, the doctors, the lawyers. It very much reminds me of what we are going to be encountering when we read Battle Royal by Ralph Ellison, where, again, the leading townspeople are there to engage in some really ugly and nefarious activities. widows, family members, and of course, Goodman himself, which means that the one thing that he's not able to accept is that he himself has a soiled a soiled soul, if you will. So, deconstructionists, if you'll remember, we had talked about the deconstruction idea of finding contradiction and paradox within text, and that would negate its meaning. And deconstructionists love young Goodman Brown because of the contradiction and the paradox about whether or not a witch meeting occurred. I don't think that negates its meaning. I think it supports the idea of the ambiguity within all of us and that we have both good and evil. The lesson to Goodman that he is not able to accept should be a lesson that we can accept, that we shouldn't lose our faith when our faith is tested in either other individuals or institutions or even within ourselves. And that religion, humanity, and Goodman all have evil. In fact, we are given a quote where basically we are told about the individuals whom are on their way supposedly to this witch meeting. And these would be, for instance, individuals such as women who were eager for widow's weeds, who gave their husband a last drink. In other words, these are women who kill their husbands so that they could have the benefits associated with widowhood. I always think of Story of an Hour in some levels about how wanton words are whispered by the hoary church elders to young maidens. In other words, the respectable men of the church are trying to seduce the young virgins in the church. About how young men who make haste to acquire their father's wealth. In other words, they kill their fathers in order to be able to gain the family's inheritance. And then also how young sweet maidens are bidding the evil to an infant's funeral. And that basically women who portray themselves to be virginal, as well they should, prior to marriage, based on the expectations and assumptions of Puritanism, are basically not virginal and become impregnated. And basically what they do is they abort the child or kill the child upon birth and bury that corpse in their garden in order to maintain their reputation of being pure and innocent. In other words, what goes on behind closed doors, despite the facade of Puritanism. And we know that Goodman is destroyed by this knowledge and he dies with no hopeful verse upon his tomb. And the idea is that Goodman is not supposed to be our role model, that we shouldn't let our faith be destroyed over the realization that there is evil in the world and that life is not as simplistic as Puritanism might perhaps make it seem. And this would be a rather bold statement for the author to be making during the time period, considering the way that the time period embraced Puritanism. But again, rather than just directly stating it and risking offending people, does so under the guise of, let me tell you a story. And through the story, hopefully we can come to that conclusion. And again, you don't necessarily have to support that conclusion, but you do have to be able to identify that conclusion. And as I believe I've suggested, there are questions at the ending of most of these stories that will help guide your reading. One of the questions at the ending of Young Goodman Brown is that this could just be an inward psychological journey that Goodman is taking. It's not necessarily a literal journey. And certainly if you are a psychological critic or Freudian, that would be a very interesting way of reading the particular text. Again, it's less about whether or not the events occur and more about the consequences of the realizations that Goodman comes to. Soldier's Home is a very different piece, even though it was still written quite a while ago. This would be in 1925 rather than something like Young Goodman Brown, which was written in 1835. But it reads very much like a contemporary piece because the language is much more accessible to what we have become accustomed to. It also is very heavy with dialogue. Dialogue is usually easier to read than exposition or just text. And that's one of the reasons why Hemingway tends to be an audience favorite. He also talks about very contemporary issues. Not to say that losing one's faith in humanity or oneself is not contemporary, but Sadly, Soldiers Home is about the status of veterans trying to reintegrate into society. And it seems like we've made very little progress when we think about where we are in the 2020s. And in contrast to where we would have been in the 1920s, there perhaps hasn't been that much of a change. Certainly, we have more understanding. And in fact, we have contemporary terms like PTSD, post traumatic stress disorder, which would not have existed during Hemingway's time. It was known as shell shock. But the idea of being misunderstood by others and perhaps also not being able to reintegrate into society is one that we still grapple with today. And unfortunately, I can say that over the many years I've taught this piece, there has never been a time where I've taught this piece where there hasn't been at least one war happening on the planet, if not multiple wars. And I'm sad to say that my fear is that that will be the case throughout the entirety of my academic career as an instructor. But the title gives you an idea that, yes, we are going to be talking about soldiers and war and the idea of home. And what is the difference between a home and a house? The house being the physical structure, but the home being the place where you are understood and loved unconditionally. And that's not necessarily what Krebs is finding. And in fact, notice that he's referred to as Krebs so often throughout the story. His surname, which is how basically soldiers are referred to, it removes their individuality. In German, because of course this is about World War I, Krebs means cancer. And one could say that this is Hemingway's examination of how war is like a cancer and that it eats you up. We are eventually given Krebs's name, which is Harold, which his mother calls him, which makes sense. And his sister calls him a nickname. Well, and usually when a nickname is used, it shows a closer relationship between two people. And I would suggest that Krebs has a closer relationship with his sister rather than anyone else. She calls him Hare, which again I think is an appropriate nickname. Hare, that is, not Hair. The hare, Hare, being a rabbit, someone or something that is frightened and skittish. And I think that would also represent Krebs in terms of his return home. And also the idea that rabbits live in holes and soldiers spend time in foxholes. So I think we can see parallels there. The military picture that we're given is not one of idealization or in any way glamour. Instead, there's an ugly reality that, of course, we might expect in 2022, but we would not necessarily expect in 1925 when war was portrayed as patriotic duty that would lead to all kinds of benefit. And that one could see the world and one could be attractive in relationship, if for no other reason because someone dressed in uniform. And in this particular time period, it would be a man dressed in uniform would be attractive. And again, in this particular time period, it would be assumed that this man would be attractive to a woman, the opposite sex, because you didn't really talk about same-sex relationships during this particular time period. And right at the very beginning, we're given an example of the picture of Krebs on the Rhine, that the uniforms don't fit. They basically are too big for their uniforms. One could say they've outgrown the military, these soldiers. Also, the fact that the military is unable to provide for them properly, and once the ugly realities of war are unearthed. The Rhine doesn't show in the picture. Again, that's supposed to be one of the selling points of the military is that you get to see the world, but they don't get to see that in their particular picture. Keep in mind, this was the time before cell phones, so having a picture would be a very valuable thing. It wasn't something that could be done as easily and as frequently as is done today with our cell phones. And the girls were not pretty. Again, that's supposed to be a selling point, and that one would be attractive to, one would assume, attractive individuals, and that wasn't the case at all. Notice how Hemingway begins the piece by contrasting that picture with another picture. This was when Krebs was in college and he was in a fraternity. One might say that there are parallels between fraternities and the military, and that you've got men who basically are indoctrinated to act the same way. And they were all wearing the same style and high collar. There are even uniforms there. Keep in mind that Krebs had enlisted, so he volunteered for this. It wasn't as if he was drafted. And what we get with Krebs on his return, quote, home, unquote, is a very different Krebs probably than the Krebs who left. One assumes that if he went to a Methodist college, that religion had some importance in his life, especially because his mother is obviously religious and she wants Krebs to pray. He's unable to do so. In other words, he's questioning religion probably because of the atrocities that he saw in the war. At one point, his mother even asked him, "Do you love me?" And we know what the answer is supposed to be. The answer he gives is no. And then he backtracks and he says, "Well, I didn't mean it," but he does mean that. And that it's very difficult for him to love or have any kind of relationship because that entails consequences. And he talks about how fearful he is of consequences after returning from the war having the ultimate level of consequence, life and death. And then, of course, one might say, too, that in many ways the war takes away consequences because much of the decision making is made by other individuals and you're supposed to follow orders. And now Krebs is in a civilian world where he's supposed to make decisions for himself and he's having difficulty doing that, as well as having difficulty fitting into the mold that society expects of him, which is to be, quote, normal, unquote, whatever that means. I always think of a quote from a text that I talk about in my horror film class from Richard Matheson, I Am Legend, where the quote is that normality is a majority concept, that basically majority makes the decision of what is, quote, normal or abnormal. And Krebs is confronted by his mother about why he can't be normal, get a job, get a girl, get married, buy a house, so forth and so on. And Krebs is nowhere near ready to do any of those things. And note how complex this story is that we can empathize and sympathize with Krebs and that he's not ready to reintegrate back into society. But yet we can also empathize and sympathize with Krebs' parents who want and need him to, in one way or another, reintegrate back. He can't continue to do this forever. You know, he talks about how the story talks about how his mother would have given him breakfast in bed if he would have liked. But this is not the support that Krebs needs. It almost reminds me of A Sorrowful Woman, that the husband is providing support, such as meals in bed, that's not really helpful ultimately for the wife, and she can't even articulate that. And I don't think Krebs is able to articulate that either. Notice how he spends his time engaged in very solitary activities, reading, eating lunch at home, playing pool, practicing the clarinet. Pool, I think, is particularly significant because pool can be played with others, but also can be played by an individual. And in pool, part of the rules of the game are to aim and shoot. And of course, aiming and shooting is part of what you do in the military. Spends a good amount of time talking about how he would like to have a girlfriend. He misses the German girls and the French girls, probably because they weren't able to speak in English. So there wasn't much in the way of conversation. The American girls obviously speak English and want conversation. And again, he doesn't necessarily want to engage in conversation. He's had some difficult times with the civilian population in that they want to hear about his experiences, but they don't want to hear about his experiences. They don't want to be bored and be told that basically he spent many of his days aimlessly doing nothing. They want excitement, but they don't want too much excitement. They don't want too much in the way that gruesomeness and the reality of war would be portrayed by a soldier who actually experienced it. What they're looking for is a kind of Hollywood version of war, PG, maybe PG 13. And Krebs talks about his frustration. In fact, that he's not even welcome back when he returns from war because the greetings are over because he returned late, which says so much about a civilian population. How could one be late from the war and the reality that everyone in the war has sacrificed, regardless of when their return is? So we see the fickle and superficial civilian population here. And how Krebs questions everything. He questions his religion. He questions the fact whether or not he loves his family. His relationship with his sister is very odd. It almost sounds inappropriate, but I would suggest that it's not. That basically when she asks, will you be my beau or boyfriend? And he says, sure, then he understands that there will not be any true consequences to that. He can't literally be her boyfriend. That basically this is more of an example of hero worship where she's asking Krebs basically, or telling Krebs that she admires him based on his status as an older brother and also his status as a soldier. Perhaps she admires him more than anybody else does in the family. Certainly, she's not critical of him in the way that others are critical of him. And he knows that, again, this is fairly innocent, her request to be a boyfriend, that it's not going to be something that is realistic or practical. The idea of his conversation with his mother, they spent a good amount of time talking about the car, the family car that Krebs was not allowed to drive ahead of time or before his return from the war. And now the parents are offering it to him, but there are strings attached, as Krebs is very well aware of. The idea is that he will use the car in order to reintegrate back into society, get a job, get a girl, and again, he's not ready for any of that. If you think about what a car represents, ask any teenager, they'll tell you that a car represents independence and freedom. And it's something that Krebs realizes he's not going to be able to find at home, which perhaps is what motivates him to move to Kansas City at the ending of the story, which we can see as a positive in that he has a fresh start and he realizes that he's not going to be able to change his family. But it can also be seen as a negative in that he's not necessarily doing it completely of his own volition. He's doing it because they want him to do it. And also the idea that he's running away rather than confronting his community and his family members. But the price is too high, so Krebs doesn't want the car. He knows that the assumption will be that he will get a job and that he will be following the imagined normalcy that his parents have pictured for him. And notice how his relationship with his father is one in which they never have direct conversation. We don't know if that was the case prior to the war, but we do know that that is the case now, which shows the level of distance he has with his father. His mother serves as kind of the translator between the two of them. And, even small details about the father, that he doesn't like his newspaper mussed up. Obviously, the father wants everything neat and detailed and tidy. And the fact that Krebs is looking not just for acknowledgement from others, but also from himself. In other words, he's fighting multiple battles, even though he's returned from the literal battle. He's fighting a battle with his community. He's fighting a battle with his family. He's fighting a battle with himself. What he's reading happens to be books about war, and he's looking for validation and that he'd been a good soldier. And in fact, he talks about that he likes the maps because basically Krebs is looking for direction. That's what maps supply, direction. And in many ways, Krebs was more at home in the war in Germany than he could ever be now in Kansas. So the ending, he is going to go to Kansas City. He is going to get a job, which again, I suggested can be both viewed as a positive or negative. And he is going to see his sister play indoor baseball. So again, it seems like he's reintegrating. But again, I don't know if that's necessarily completely of his own volition or in his best interest at this point in time. So again, I think what we've got are authors who show us a certain level of complexity. That's what makes literature really worthy of study, as opposed to formulaic writing that gives us a simplistic view of the world, which is what we saw with Faye and Kai in A Secret Sorrow. And I think we can see complexity in Young Goodman Brown and ambiguity in Young Goodman Brown and also in Soldier's Home. And again, we have questions at the ending of the text to help direct our reading. And then lastly, Battle Royal, which happens to be from a novel, Invisible Man. I knew there wouldn't be time to read a novel in its entirety, but I did want to give you the plot of Invisible Man, where it begins with a black man in the 1950s who basically is hiding in the basement of an affluent Caucasian neighborhood, knowing that he would never be allowed to live there because of segregation. And he's in the basement and surrounded by darkness, but he also is surrounded by thousands of lights that he set up because he is stealing electricity from the electric company, or he is stealing power from the power company. And light and dark is going to be a major theme that we'll see throughout the novel. And he talks about how he's hibernating. In other words, he's contemplating. And the assumption is that he will leave his hibernation and do something. But at this point, he wants to tell us about his life story as an invisible man, that he feels that he's invisible because he's seen merely for his ethnicity and never for his individuality. and that it all began with him as a young man graduating from high school, where he was asked to read a speech to some of the leading citizens of the day, a speech that he had delivered at his graduation to great acclaim. So this is the story of Battle Royal that we're going to be reading. And we know that at the ending of the story of Battle Royal, what ends up happening is that he's given a scholarship, which might imply that his going to college would be a positive, though we're given some foreshadowing that it won't be because he has a terrible nightmare that I'll be talking about briefly from his grandfather. But the book then picks up with a good 200 or so pages of him in college, thinking, or his belief is that he can achieve status and respect and the American dream if he gets education. And he realizes after about 200 pages or so that's false, that education provides status and respect and opportunity only to those individuals who have privilege and power, certainly not to a black man. And what he realizes is that the educational system and the political system is corrupt, and that he comes to the conclusion that it needs to be reformed from within. So he spends about 200 pages or so of the novel trying to reform the political system so that it offers the equality it claims it offers. And he comes to the conclusion that the political system is so corrupt, much like the educational system is so corrupt, that there will never be equality for someone like himself because of the color of his skin. So then he meets a character named Ross the Destroyer, and he's just that. He destroys things. And he convinces the Invisible Man that basically the only way to change society is to have revolution. And they decide to try to revolt. And in the process of that, after about 200 pages or so, when the Invisible Man is confronted with a riot that he helped to start and he watches his burning community around him, he realizes that violence and revolt isn't the answer either. It just leads to more despair for people like himself because of the color of his skin. So then what he decides to do, that rather than have a coup or a revolt or an uprising, he needs a kind of timeout. He wants to hibernate and think about what to do next. So then he ends up finding a basement in an all-Caucasian affluent neighborhood that he hides in, that he would never be allowed to be in because of the color of his skin. So basically, the ending of the novel ends in much the same way the beginning begins. The novel is circular. And he hides in the darkness, but he's rigged up thousands of lights that he's stolen from the electric company and their electricity, or stealing power from the power company. And he talks about how he's hibernating. He's basically taking a rest, contemplating his options. And that is where the novel ends. And I've always liked the idea that the author didn't supply us with an easy answer, because there is no easy answer to things like racism and sexism, which is also addressed in the book, but not nearly as much as racism. Though we did see sexism even in the short story that we read, which appeared initially as an independent short story from the novel, so it can stand on its own. But again, reading the novel in its entirety gives us a much more thorough understanding of the Invisible Man. And basically, what the author Ellison is asking us to do as reader is to provide the answer. The Invisible Man wasn't able to provide the answer to racism or sexism or classism, and the burden is on us as reader. And in some ways, when we think about how the world has progressed since the 1950s, we've been able to do that as a society. I don't think Ellison could have ever expected that we would have an African American president. That said, I don't think Ellison could have ever expected the backlash that occurred afterwards. So in many ways, we are in exactly the same place that we would have been in the 1950s, perhaps even in some ways a worse place. So we read this opening chapter of the novel, Battle Royal, and we are given a clue just from the title that we are going to be talking about battles. Not just literal battles, such as the boxing match that we are introduced to in this story, but also figurative battles, since the Invisible Man is fighting against society and fighting against racism, and also he is fighting against himself, because he is an adult who basically is narrating, reflecting on his youth and indicating that in his youth, much like young Goodman Brown, he didn't really have an understanding in the way that he has an understanding now. And that he is invisible again because of his ethnicity. And he talks about his grandfather and how, as a youth, he didn't really understand his grandfather's deathbed confession. And of course, on the deathbed is usually where most people tell the truth, where the grandfather says that he's a spy in the enemy's country. And he's been living with his head in the lion's mouth. And the goal is to overcome him with yeses. And basically, what this means when you're a spy is basically when you are in enemy territory and you are gathering information so that you can overthrow the enemy. This is what the grandfather says he's been doing by overcoming them with yeses, by appearing to be humble. What the grandfather has basically been doing is being a spy by gaining access into society and basically living in his with his head in the lion's mouth, the lion being the racist members of society, the Caucasian individuals who will not give him equality. And this is something that the grandfather is trying to teach to the rest of the family members, that this is the way that they need to fight this battle, that they need to be very covert about it and they need to be very subversive about it. But of course, the Invisible Man doesn't necessarily understand this. He's hoping that if he can just show his intelligence, in this instance by giving his speech, he can earn status and respect in society. And the leading citizens, notice they're all male, are there. And again, it reminds me of young Goodman Brown, all of the professionals. And instead of allowing the Invisible Man to read his speech, first he has to entertain them. He finds out that there is a humiliating and a brutalizing boxing match that he needs to engage in. Again, the boxing match is a wonderful symbol or metaphor for the fight that African Americans and all disenfranchised people have to fight. Rather than fight against the people who are oppressing them, they have to fight against each other, which is what we see in the boxing ring, for whatever crumbs or status they can get, which is one of the reasons why the last boxer who's left with the Invisible Man refuses to fix the fight, because this is the only way that that boxer can gain status, is by at least winning the boxing match. And the Invisible Man asks, why would you not want to fix this? And why would you want to continue having a real fight? And he asks, is this for them? And he's told, no, this is for me. And basically, we see the use of the N-word. This is a very ugly story that shows the reality of racism. That was the intent from Ellison, was to show the realities of the ugliness of the racism that exists within a society and any ugliness associated with disenfranchised groups. But because the Invisible Man feels like an outsider and invisible and misunderstood, it's a piece that could be read by everybody and can be accepted by everybody, because everybody has probably felt invisible or misunderstood. So it was a piece that was very popular and was very acclaimed when it came out, because it can be read on multiple levels, not just about racism or sexism or classism. And that said, Ellison wrote this piece when he was very young, which ended up being rather negative for him rather than positive, because there were always expectations that if he could write something that was so symbolic and so powerful, it really is, the entire novel reads like a short story because of the symbolism, then who knows what he could create during the rest of his career. And unfortunately, he was never able to live up to the status of this particular text, so he always lived in the shadow of it. I suspect if he had written this at the ending of his career, it would have been seen as his crowning achievement. And so, just to give you an idea of some of the symbolism, little minor details. For instance, the citizens are said to be wolfing down their food, not eating their food or gulping down their food, wolfing it down. Think about how a wolf is oftentimes associated with a predatory nature, a dangerous animal, the bestial. And that's the idea that this is what these leading citizens are, as they're wearing their tuxedos. And tuxedos are both black and white, since the story is about black and white, literally in terms of skin color, but also lots of symbolism about darkness and also white, or the idea of lightness and hope and opportunity. We are told that they are smoking black cigars, the idea that they are consuming things that are black, which is what we are going to be seeing with the boxers as well, and the idea of racism as a whole. They are confronted with a naked blonde at one point in order to embarrass and humiliate them because they're wearing such little clothing, just their boxing their boxing shorts, that it's very obvious that they are physically excited. And certainly this could be something that could result in death, a black man showing physical interest in a white woman. A blonde, no less, because that's supposed to represent the ideal in society. And she's naked with an American flag tattooed on her. In other words, she's supposed to represent through that American flag America itself and the American dream, where they can look, but they can never have, they can never touch. So it's a tease. And then, of course, eventually, after that horrific boxing match, which is a metaphor for the societal and personal battles of the disenfranchised, they're supposed to be paid for their participation in this boxing match. But before they're paid, they need to grab their money from an electrified rug. Again, electricity being so important in this text to represent power, as well as the idea of them being hurt, and they find out that the payment is false. It's just a card token. Again, that all of this is just a misrepresentation. They can never really achieve equality in this world. And the fact that afterwards the Invisible Man is so eager to give his speech, hoping that he can still gain respect and acclaim, shows how little understanding he has of the system at that point when he's a young man, that he still doesn't understand his grandfather's words. But during his speech, he makes an error. And in fact, even before his speech, he talks about how he topples over one of the chairs of the men, which would be very dangerous to do as he's trying to save that naked blonde, that he wants to protect her, but he also hates her because she's put him in this position as well. So we see that on some level there is a rebelliousness to this Invisible Man. But the error that he makes would suggest that this is more than just an innocent error, that this is his subconscious. In fact, Freud argued that whenever we make an error in speech, that basically, or a misstatement, that is a representation of our subconscious. You can decide whether you agree or disagree, but the Invisible Man during his speech is supposed to say social responsibility. And of course, no one is listening to his speech until he makes that error and says social equality. And social equality is quite different from social responsibility. And now he has everyone's attention as they basically question him. What do you mean by equality? It's like, oh, I didn't mean equality. I meant responsibility. I was swallowing blood. And think about how that works literally. Of course, he's literally swallowing blood. He's been beaten up black and blue because of the boxing match. But it's also an expression that we use when you have to swallow something that's disagreeable to you. And the idea of black and blue and the blues, not just a color, but also in terms of a musical movement, will be important in this novel if you ever get the chance to read the novel in its entirety. And I highly encourage that you do. In my opinion, it's perhaps the best novel ever written because of its incredible use of language and symbolism. But the idea of the blues is something that plays a role in there. And the blues being perhaps the only musical form that was invented in the United States. So I think that's an important element as well, talking about the great heritage and the great contribution of blacks to the United States, which we see in the story as well. But eventually, the Invisible Man is able to convince them that it was merely an innocent mistake, and he's awarded with, and notice that it was wrapped in white tissue paper, again, to illustrate the white and black imagery, a briefcase. And think about how briefcases are supposed to represent business and professional success. The idea is that this is what he can achieve one day as well. And that within that briefcase happens to be a scholarship to the, quote, Negro, unquote, college, because again, there's still segregation at this point. And the Invisible Man is thrilled and says that he can't even be disturbed by his grandfather's words. And unfortunately, then he has a dream, a nightmare, where the grandfather is with the Invisible Man at a circus. One might say that this is representational of the circus that the or the society really is about, and the circus nature of what the Invisible Man had to undergo in terms of delivering his speech. It was all absurd and ridiculous and purely for entertainment and not real. And that ultimately the grandfather refuses to laugh at the clowns. And of course, you're supposed to laugh at clowns. So in this way, the grandfather is not participating in the expectations of his society. You can also say that the clowns are basically those individuals who are in power, and they don't necessarily deserve any kind of respect or esteem or any kind of attention. And then, of course, the Invisible Man is told to open up an envelope, and it's one envelope after another envelope after another envelope, and the grandfather supplies the symbolic meaning for that, saying them's years. It almost reminds me of those nesting dolls that you might see, one within another within another. And then finally the grandfather says to read what the last envelope says, which says to keep this end boy running. And of course, this is the Invisible Man's subconscious trying to tell him that what the situation is that the system has been fixed, and that yes, he might have earned a certain level of esteem and accolade with his high school graduation speech when he delivered it at high school. That is not going to change anything in terms of his lack of status, his lack of agency, and his lack of power in society, despite being told the contrary. And this is because he is an invisible man because of the color of his skin. So this gives you an idea of the 3 short stories that I had selected. And I thought that for today's attendance question, I would ask, which of these short stories did you dislike the most and why? I've asked you which one did you like the most and why in a previous question, so I thought we could go with dislike the most and why. And then we can finish up our short story unit next class, where we talk about our last 2 short stories. Both are very short, Girl and Popular Mechanics. They're also much more contemporary, and they also are much more experimental, probably because they are much more contemporary. Then we could talk a little bit about writing assignments, not just journals, where I'm going to be asking you to select 3 short stories from the short story unit and to identify in a page for each of those short stories any thoughts or ideas or reflections that you have about these stories. More than just plot. Certainly you can write more than a page, but I thought that that would give you a good snapshot of the story itself for each of the 3, and then I could respond in turn as if we were having a conversation on paper. And I'm grading it informally on a checkmark system, not evaluating for grammar or mechanics, just for content. So it would be a way for us to dialogue about 3 of the short stories that we've done in the short story unit. And I ask that you send that to me via PDF to my email address, which is ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu, because that's the best way my grading program works. And I will write comments as if we were having a conversation on paper and return that back to you. But that won't be due until the ending of our short story unit. And then hopefully those journals will help you with thinking of some ideas for more formal writing assignments, because there will be a paper of approximately 4 to 5 pages in length, a critical paper, meaning that you focus on the text itself, not on research or outside sources, where you get to focus on a particular element within short story. So next class, what I'll do is finish up the short story unit and then talk more about journals and also the paper, and do some review with possible paper topics, and also some suggestions on how to go about writing a paper. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we'll continue on soon. Take care. Bye-bye.